bitter wind swept through the yard as a young black girl clutched her worn teddy bear, her world collapsing in the shadow of betrayal. Yet deep within that battered toy rested a truth sharp enough to tear through every lie around her, a truth that would spark a battle between cruelty and justice, leaving those who tried to silence her stunned by what she carried in her small hands. This is not just a story of loss, it is a story of revelation and strength. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments along with where you are watching from. Right after her father's burial, 6-year-old Amara Johnson, a black girl, was dragged into the yard by her white stepmother Margaret Hayes and her lover Thomas Reed. They poured cold water over her head, threw away her teddy bear, and called her a curse. Neighbors saw, but shut their doors in silence. Amara Johnson was not just any child. She was a black girl whose very presence reminded her father's second wife of everything she despised. Her father, Richard Johnson, had been a respected black entrepreneur, a man who built a successful real estate business through relentless hard work and determination, admired by the community for his dignity and compassion. But his death, after a long illness, left Amara without protection, and Margaret wasted no time in stripping the girl of love, safety, and belonging. As they returned from the funeral, the contrast was unbearable. The mourners had barely left when Margaret's crocodile tears dried instantly, her pale face hardening into cruelty. She tore off her veil, her icy eyes landing on Amara as if the child were nothing but a stain. Thomas Reed, her lover, a smug white man with slicked hair and whiskey on his breath, carried his suitcase like he was moving in permanently, settling into the leather chair as though the house were already his. Amara, small in stature, with tightly coiled hair and brown skin glowing faintly in the dim light, clutched her teddy bear, her last gift from her mother, who had died in a car accident years earlier. Her wide eyes were rimmed with red, her voice trembling as she tried to please. "Mom, I can clean the house. I'll be good." The word "mom" slipped out with innocent hope, but it only fueled Margaret's hatred. "Don't you dare call me that," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "You're nothing but baggage. From now on, I am the lady of this house. You have no rights here." Amara froze, her hands gripping the bear tighter, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. She remembered how her father used to kneel down, look her in the eyes, and remind her, "Amara, you are worthy." Now those words clashed with the present, where every gesture, every look, screamed that she was unwanted. Thomas took a long swig of bourbon, set the bottle down with a loud thud, and let out a harsh laugh. "Look at this pitiful brat," he mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Clinging to that ragged toy like it means something. Your daddy spoiled you rotten. He's gone now, and so is your little princess crown. You're nothing but bad luck, and this house doesn't need you." Amara's small body trembled. She wanted to speak, to say she could be quiet, invisible even, but her words came out as stammers. I'll be good. Please. I won't be a bother." Margaret's eyes flared with cruelty. She grabbed the child's tiny suitcase, already packed with a few worn clothes, and shoved it toward the door. She ripped the teddy bear from Amara's hands, tossing it into the mud of the yard. "Get out. You're not my child. You're cursed. Your father died because of you, your mother died because of you, and I refuse to live another day with a parasite like you under my roof." Her words struck like whips across Amara's fragile heart. Margaret stormed outside with a bucket filled with icy water, dragging Amara with her. The little girl pleaded desperately, her voice breaking. "Please don't. I'll be quiet. I'll never speak again." But Margaret sneered. "You're filth. You need to be washed clean." She hurled the freezing water onto the girl, soaking her from head to toe. Amara screamed, the shock of the cold piercing her thin frame, her braids dripping, her small body trembling violently. She collapsed onto the wet ground, shivering uncontrollably, her skin burning from the icy sting. Thomas pressed his shoe down onto the sodden teddy bear, smirking as he crushed it into the dirt. "Perfect," he said, his tone mocking. "Now she looks just like she is, a stray mutt no different from the trash on the street." Amara gasped for breath, her tiny hands clawing at the earth as tears mingled with the water on her face. She whispered through sobs, "Daddy, where am I supposed to go now?" Her voice was barely audible, yet heavy enough to pierce the night air. Across the street, neighbors peered from behind curtains, but the moment her tearful gaze met theirs, they quickly shut their doors. Fear, prejudice, and apathy kept them silent. Amara was utterly alone, abandoned not only by the people in her house, but also by the community that refused to see her suffering. Kneeling in the cold, her soaked dress clinging to her body, she clasped her hands together as if in prayer, whispering to herself, "Please, someone don't leave me alone." The plea dissolved into the darkness, swallowed by the sound of dripping water and cruel laughter. But inside her chest, the faintest spark flickered, born of her father's memory, his voice repeating, "Amara, you are worthy." She hugged herself, rocking slightly, trying to hold onto the belief that her father's words were still true. She did not yet know that her cry had been heard in ways she could not imagine, that her humiliation this night would spark a chain of events that would expose every hidden cruelty and bring her justice. For now, she was just a child drenched in sorrow, trembling in the night, on the edge of despair, but clinging to a fragile hope that love and justice could still find her. The night air still clung to Amara's skin as she sat trembling in the yard, her small body soaked through, her teddy bear ruined in the mud, her pleas echoing into silence. But fate shifted when the deep growl of an approaching engine cut through the darkness. A sleek black Lincoln slowed to a stop outside the gate, its headlights washing over the broken scene, and from the driver's seat stepped out a tall black man in his 40s, his frame broad, his suit pressed, his presence commanding. His name was David Carter, a self-made millionaire whose face had appeared in financial magazines and on television panels. Yet in that moment he was not the cool strategist or the business mogul, but a man whose eyes locked on the sight of a child abandoned, drenched, and shivering, and his jaw tightened with a fury he fought to contain. David had known Richard Johnson since they were young men struggling to carve their paths in a world stacked against them, both black men who had endured prejudice and hardship. But while Richard chose stability and family, David had pursued empire building, and though his fortune was vast, his heart carried scars of an upbringing marred by a cruel white stepfather who left him bruised in both body and soul. Scars that resurfaced now as he saw Amara hunched in the yard, her lips trembling with the same helpless fear he once carried. He stepped forward, his polished shoes splashing against the puddles, and with one swift motion he removed his coat, draping it gently around Amara's shoulders, the warmth of the fabric embracing her small frame, her wide eyes blinking up at him with both fear and fragile hope. His voice came low, hoarse, but every syllable pressed down like iron. "Richard has been gone less than a day, and this is how you treat his daughter?" Margaret flinched at his sudden arrival, quickly shifting her expression from venom to feigned innocence, crocodile tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Her voice quivering as she said, "You misunderstand, David. I was only trying to teach her manners. She is stubborn, disrespectful. I was scaring her a little, nothing more." Thomas leaned back against the doorframe, a smirk curling his lips, his hand gripping the neck of the bourbon bottle, his voice dripping with mockery. "You already missed the funeral, Carter. Now you show up to play the hero? This is family business, none of your concern, so stay out of it." David's eyes, sharp as blades, turned toward him with a cold flash that made Thomas's smirk falter for a heartbeat. Then David looked back down at Amara, who clung desperately to his coat, her small fingers knotting into the fabric as if afraid he would vanish, her whisper cracked by fear. "Uncle, they'll throw me out again. I have nowhere else to go. Please don't leave me." Her words pierced him deeper than any insult ever had, because they mirrored the boy he once was, hiding under a table from the rage of a drunk man, begging for someone to step in, and Richard had once been that someone pulling him out, giving him a place to stand. And now, with Richard gone, David understood that the debt he had carried for decades could only be repaid in this moment. He drew a deep breath, his voice firm, leaving no space for argument. "She's coming with me." Margaret's face hardened, her mouth twisting as if to lash out, but Thomas touched her arm, leaning close to whisper with a smirk, "Let him take her. The brat will crawl back sooner or later. She's nothing but bad luck anyway." Margaret swallowed her protest, forcing a bitter smile that failed to hide the malice in her eyes. her voice icy as she spat. "Fine, play the hero if you want. Let's see how long you can keep her. She'll ruin you just like she ruined everyone else." David ignored her entirely, bending down to lift Amara into his arms, her body light as a feather yet heavy with grief, her face pressing into his chest as tears soaked through his shirt. And without another word, he carried her toward the waiting Lincoln. The door opened softly, the leather interior swallowing them in its embrace, and David settled her gently onto the seat, tucking the coat firmly around her before sliding behind the wheel. The engine rumbled as the car pulled away, leaving Margaret and Thomas framed in the glow of the porch light, their figures shrinking in the rearview mirror as the house receded into the distance. But David's focus never wavered from the trembling child beside him. Amara turned her face toward him, her voice no louder than a breath. "Sir, are you going to leave me too, like she did?" The words slammed into him harder than any insult or accusation, because he knew them too well. He had once asked the same question into the void, and the silence that answered him back then had shaped the man he became. So this time he refused to let silence be the answer. He pressed his foot a little harder on the accelerator, the Lincoln gliding smoothly onto the highway as he forced the words through his clenched throat. "No one is going to leave you tonight." And though his voice came low and strained, the conviction in it made Amara's gaze soften for a fleeting moment. She pressed her teddy bear, still wet and matted, against her chest, her little frame shivering beneath the oversized coat, her thoughts a storm of fear and doubt, because every adult who had promised care had abandoned her, and trust was no longer natural to her. It was earned in scraps. And though this man seemed strong, she still braced herself for the possibility that he too would disappear, yet something about his presence, the steady way he gripped the wheel, the calm control he exuded, sparked a fragile hope inside her that maybe this time would be different. David guided the car into the underground garage of his high-rise building, the concrete walls echoing with the low growl of the engine. And when he parked in his reserved spot, he turned to her, his dark eyes steady, but softening at the sight of her shrinking against the seat. And he said gently, "Come on, let's get you warm." He opened her door, lifted her small body into his arms, and carried her through the polished lobby where the doorman, Mr. Harris, gave a polite nod, his eyes lingering on the soaked little girl, but silenced by the firm look on David's face. And the elevator carried them upward in hushed stillness until the doors opened into the wide hallway leading to his penthouse. Inside, the apartment spread out in modern lines and quiet elegance, but it was sterile with the kind of silence that wealth often brought, a silence Amara found intimidating rather than comforting. Yet David moved quickly, setting her gently on a chair, fetching a soft towel, and placing a folded sweater and sweatpants on the counter, telling her quietly, "Go change, they'll fit enough for now." And she obeyed, shuffling into the bathroom with cautious steps, reappearing moments later, swallowed in the oversized clothes, her braids damp but no longer dripping, her little figure even smaller beneath the sweater. David ladled steaming chicken soup into a bowl, placing it in front of her with a spoon, and sat across the table, his hands folded as he watched her stare at the food with hesitation, until finally she pushed the bowl slightly back and murmured, "I'll only eat a little. I don't want to get yelled at." His chest tightened at the words, because they revealed the invisible wounds left by Margaret's cruelty, scars that no amount of money could erase. So he leaned forward and said slowly, "Here, you don't need permission to eat, you don't need to fear punishment. You eat when you're hungry and rest when you're tired. This is your space too." The message seemed foreign to her, but she picked up the spoon and took a tentative bite, blowing softly on the soup before tasting it. Then another bite followed, and David remained still, not rushing her, simply offering his presence as she cautiously filled her stomach. Halfway through the bowl, she set down the spoon and looked at him, her voice barely audible. "You don't hate me, do you?" He inhaled slowly before answering. "No one has the right to hate a child for existing." She lowered her gaze, whispering, "They said I was bad luck." David shook his head firmly. "You are Richard's daughter, and you are yourself, and no cruelty can define you." He stood, took a thin blanket from a sofa, and draped it over her legs, tidying the dishes with quiet efficiency, the clinking of utensils filling the silence. Amara whispered again, her words fragile, "I won't make the house dirty," and David paused, turning back to her with a faint smile. "A house is meant to be lived in, not to be a showroom. You're allowed to make a mess." The faintest flicker of relief passed across her face, the first sign of release since she had been torn from the cemetery hours earlier. Later that night, David led her to the guest bedroom, a space already made with clean sheets and a small moon-shaped lamp on the side table. And he asked softly, "Do you want to call anyone?" But she shook her head, clutching her teddy bear tightly, her eyes stinging with unshed tears as she slipped under the blanket. David closed the door halfway and sat outside in the hallway, his back against the wall, listening to her muffled sobs that eventually faded into uneven breaths. His own eyes stinging as fragments of his childhood resurfaced, nights when he had counted his stepfather's footsteps and swallowed his cries to avoid further punishment. And he silently vowed he would not let history repeat itself for this child. School administrators to contact, a child psychologist to arrange, and most importantly, a confrontation with Margaret and Thomas that could not be avoided. But as he typed, his eyes flickered toward the closed door of the guest room, his mind replaying the faint sobs that had slipped through the crack hours earlier, sobs that mirrored his own from decades ago. And he clenched his fists, silently promising that no one would ever strip this child of dignity again. When morning arrived, the smell of coffee drifted into the air and the sound of small footsteps padded into the kitchen. Amara appeared clutching her teddy bear, her braids slightly frizzy, her oversized sweater slipping off one shoulder, her eyes still red from crying, but steadier now. And she said softly, "Good morning," as if testing whether she was truly allowed to exist peacefully in this space. David turned from a stove where he had been warming oatmeal and smiled faintly. "Good morning. Sweetheart, did you sleep okay?" She nodded slowly but then frowned, staring at her bear with curiosity, because one of its seams had loosened overnight and a small piece of fabric dangled at the edge of its ear. She tugged gently and felt something hard beneath the stuffing. Her eyes widened. "Uncle David, the bear is torn, and there's something inside." David's brow furrowed. He took the bear carefully, slipped his finger into the seam, and pulled out a silver USB drive no bigger than his thumb. His heartbeat quickened. He looked at Amara and asked softly, "Do you want to see together what's inside?" She nodded, still holding onto the bear as if its magic had not yet faded, and David carried the drive to his laptop, inserted it, and waited as the screen revealed a single audio file marked with a date from 1 year ago. His hand hovered over the mouse before he finally clicked play, and the room filled with the shaky but unmistakable voice of Richard Johnson. "What is this bottle of medicine? I don't need this. When I take it, my heart races. Margaret, where did you get this?" There was a pause, then Thomas's voice cold and flat. "The doctor prescribed it. Take it. You're weak. Don't be paranoid." Another. Silence stretched. Then came Margaret's whisper, dripping with malice. "Let him drink more. Let him die already." And in that instant Amara gasped, tears springing to her eyes as the truth crashed over her. "They poisoned my dad," she cried, her body shaking with grief and fury. David pressed his palm to the edge of the table, his jaw tight, his mind racing, but his voice low and steady as he placed his hand gently over hers. "Your father didn't want you to live in fear. He left you the truth, and now it's our duty to use it." Amara's small fingers clutched the bear tighter, tears soaking its fur. Daddy knew, he knew what they were doing. And David nodded, his voice resolute. Maybe he couldn't stop them, but he believed someone would protect you and preserve this evidence. Today, that someone is me. I will expose every one of them. He replayed sections of the file, noting the clink of a glass, the scrape of a chair, the exact timestamps, his businessman's mind already calculating steps like a chessboard. He made 2 backup copies, one on the hard drive, one on the cloud, then placed the USB into a shockproof pouch and locked it in the safe in his office, his movements deliberate and precise, not a second wasted. Amara's eyes filled with fear as she asked, "If they find out, will they take it away?" David met her gaze, his eyes steady. "No one will take it from us, not even them." He pulled out his phone and dialed the number of Professor Henry Walker, a seasoned attorney who had guided him through complex financial battles. The voice on the other end calm and assured, "Keep everything as it is. Do not transmit anything digitally. I'll come to you. Protect the child first." And David hung up with a short nod to himself, then bent down to Amara's level. "This morning we will have breakfast. Then Uncle Henry will come. He doesn't say much, but he always stands on the side of the truth." Amara wiped her tears with the sleeve of her sweater, whispering to the bear, "Daddy, I found what you left. I'll hold it tight." And David's chest ached with both sorrow and pride, because in her small act of courage, he saw the reflection of Richard's strength. Across town, however, Margaret slammed a newspaper onto the glass table, the headline blaring, "Millionaire David Carter takes Johnson's daughter from family home," her manicured nails digging into the wood as she hissed, "He's challenging me." David squeezed her hand gently, reassuring her that they were walking not into danger, but toward light, toward proof, toward justice. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of paper and ink. Rows of shelves stretched endlessly, and at the information desk sat a young white woman in her 20s with neatly tied hair and a badge pinned to her sweater reading Sarah Mitchell, her face kind but focused, her eyes sharpening as she noticed Amara's small frame and David's grave expression. David set a thin folder on the desk, a file that contained copies of Richard Johnson's will, stock registration documents, and treatment schedules from the hospital, and he spoke in a tone low but unwavering. "We need to cross-check the authenticity of these documents, the dates, the signatures, any irregularities, especially around March of last year." Sarah glanced through the papers quickly, her librarian's precision turning on like a switch. Then she extended her hand toward Amara and smiled softly. "Hello there. My name is Sarah. I'll help you and your uncle find the right answers today." And Amara hesitated for a moment before placing her small hand in Sarah's, the gesture fragile but symbolic, because for the first time since losing her father, an adult outside of David seemed willing to believe her without question. Sarah turned to her computer, her fingers flying across the keys as she accessed corporate registries, public notary databases, and the hospital's digital archives. Her voice calm as she narrated her process so they could follow. "I'll start with the stock transfer agreement," she murmured. Then her expression froze as the screen populated with details, her brows knitting together. The date listed here is March 14th, but according to the hospital records, Richard Johnson was admitted for his second round of treatment that very day, and he was under heavy sedation for 48 hours, which means he could not have been conscious enough to sign anything. David's jaw tightened, his suspicions now given weight, while Sarah swiveled the monitor toward them so both he and Amara could see the glaring inconsistency. The signature scrawled on the contract beside Richard's name compared against his older verified samples. The slope of the letters uneven, the pressure of the pen strokes off, clear signs of forgery. Amara's eyes widened as she whispered, "They lied, they made him sign when he couldn't," her voice quivering with the weight of betrayal. And Sarah shook her head gently. "No, sweetheart, he didn't sign this at all. Someone else did." She printed 2 copies of the documents, clipping them neatly and marking the time discrepancy with a red pen, then slid them into a folder. "I'll create a comparison table that includes the hospital admission logs, the signature samples from previous years, and the suspicious contract. This will establish a strong case of forgery," she explained, her voice steady, her commitment to the truth shining through her professional calm. Amara blinked up at her with watery eyes. "Do you believe me that I'm not lying?" And Sarah leaned down, meeting the little girl's gaze without hesitation. "I believe you, and I'll help you." David exhaled slowly, placing a reassuring hand on Amara's shoulder like an anchor, then turned to Sarah. "Thank you. If there are any copying fees or access charges, put them on me." But Sarah shook her head. "No. Public records are every citizen's right. You don't need to pay for truth." She paused, then lowered her voice. "But you should brace yourself. I've already seen a news alert going up on a local site. They're spinning the story their way, painting you as the villain." At that moment, David's phone buzzed with a message from Professor Henry Walker. Calm words appearing on the screen. "Keep Emma close. I have filed for a temporary protection order and notified family court. Prepare duplicates of all evidence. Meet me this afternoon." David typed back quickly. "We have audio evidence of poisoning, and now signs of contract forgery, witnesses pending," and then slipped the phone back into his pocket, his focus razor sharp. Sarah guided Amara to the scanning station, showing her how to press the papers flat against the glass and push the button, encouraging her with soft words. "You're doing great." And for the first time that day, a faint smile touched Amara's lips as the machine hummed and produced copies, her small hand resting on the edge of the scanner as if she too was actively fighting for her father's memory. David took the finished folder from Sarah, neatly clipped and labeled, and shook her hand firmly. "Not if others tell the truth too, and I'll make sure they don't stand alone." Their first stop was an aging brick apartment building not far from the Johnson home. The stairs creaked as David climbed with Amara at his side, and when the door to apartment 2B opened, An elderly white woman with neatly cropped hair and tired eyes peered out, her hands still dusted with flour from the bread she had been kneading. Her name was Mrs. Dorothy Clark. She had been a neighbor of the Johnsons for decades, and though she had always waved politely to Richard and occasionally given Amara a cookie, she had avoided confrontation when Margaret moved in. She glanced nervously down the hall before whispering, "I don't want trouble." David introduced himself, offering his business card, his voice calm but firm. "I was Richard's friend. I need to know what you saw yesterday after the funeral." Dorothy's lips trembled, her eyes darting toward Amara, who stood clutching the bear, and finally she exhaled. "I saw them drag her outside. Thomas grabbed her wrist so hard she stumbled, and Margaret carried a bucket. They poured it straight over her head. The poor child was shaking like a leaf." She hesitated, her hands twisting the apron at her waist. "But I was afraid. They have money connections. I thought if I spoke they'd ruin me." David stepped closer, lowering his voice but making each word deliberate. "If you stay silent, she will never be free of them. But if you speak, you won't be alone. I'll stand with you, and I'll make sure you're protected." Dorothy's eyes glistened as she looked at Amara, who whispered timidly, "Please, Miss Clark, they'll hurt me if nobody helps." Dorothy closed her eyes for a long moment, then finally opened the door wider, her voice steadier. "I want to tell the truth, but promise me I won't be left alone in this." David nodded firmly. "My attorney will arrange protection for witnesses. You will not face this without support." Dorothy gave a slow nod, accepting the slip of paper with Professor Walker's phone number that David pressed into her hand, the first small crack of courage breaking through her fear. As they left the apartment, Dorothy pointed toward the back lot. "Talk to Frank. He saw it too." At the edge of the parking area, sitting on an old wooden crate, was a thin black man in a frayed jacket, his beard patchy, his hands rough and cracked from years of living on the street. His name was Frank Lamore, known around the neighborhood as Frank, the quiet homeless man who often slept in the alley or helped sweep stoops for spare change. Dorothy called out softly, "Frank, come over here a minute." Frank eyed David with suspicion at first, his shoulders tense. But when David handed him a hot coffee from a nearby cart, the steam curling into the cool air, Frank accepted it with a grunt of thanks, his fingers curling around the cup with gratitude. David said evenly, "I was Richard's friend. I need to know what you saw." Frank took a sip, then cleared his throat, his voice rough but firm. "I saw it. They dragged that girl like she was a sack of potatoes. She slipped on the steps, crying without making a sound, and I wanted to step in, but Robert, he caught himself. Thomas glared at me. And I've got nothing, no home, no family. I thought he'd kill me if I moved." He looked at Amara then, his expression softening. "But that girl doesn't deserve the life I've had. I'll tell the truth. I'll stand in court if I have to." David placed a strong hand on his shoulder, gratitude deep in his voice. "Thank you, Frank. Your word means more than you know." He handed him a card with Walker's number and an appointment time, ensuring he would be included in the witness list. And for a moment the three of them, David, Dorothy, and Frank, stood in the morning light bound by a vow unspoken but powerful, a promise that truth would not be silenced. On the way back to the car, Amara leaned into David, whispering, "Why would they help me when they're so scared?" And David answered quietly, "Because sometimes fear bows to what is right, and you gave them a reason to be brave." Amara nodded slowly, a flicker of pride glinting in her tear-stained eyes, the first fragile sense that perhaps she was not powerless after all. That afternoon, David met briefly with Walker at his office, sliding the new witness statements across the polished desk, and Walker read them carefully, his sharp mind already preparing motions for court. "These are strong, especially combined with the audio and the forged contracts. But we must be cautious. They will attempt to discredit everyone, especially Frank, given his circumstances." David leaned forward, his voice steady. "Then we'll make sure Frank is seen as he truly is, a man who had nothing left to lose and still chose truth over silence." Walker gave a curt nod. "I'll request a witness protection order immediately. Intimidation will not be tolerated." By evening, Amara sat quietly at the kitchen table drawing with crayons David had bought her, her small fingers sketching a house with a door open wide and two figures standing side by side, one tall, one small, both holding hands, and when David returned from his call with Walker, she held up the picture shyly. "This is us, right?" He knelt down, nodding with a soft smile. "Yes, that's us." The night after Dorothy and Franklin agreed to testify carried a different weight in the penthouse. For the first time since the funeral, Amara slept without whimpering in her dreams. Her teddy bear clutched firmly in her arms, as if the small toy had transformed from a relic of sorrow into a vessel of strength. But David remained awake long past midnight, pacing the length of his office with the witness statements spread across his desk, the USB safely locked in the wall safe, and the forged contract copies neatly organized. His mind moving like a strategist calculating not just one battle, but a war. Because Margaret and Thomas would not fold easily. They had money, they had influence, they had a willingness to manipulate public opinion. And if he underestimated them for even a moment, Amara would pay the price. So every step had to be deliberate and every detail flawless. At dawn, David brewed coffee strong enough to steady his nerves and began calling his legal team, ordering them to prepare comparative reports of Richard's signatures from the last 5 years, each authenticated by forensic experts, because he knew Margaret's lawyer would claim the documents were fabricated. And when he hung up, he found Amara standing quietly in the doorway, her braids slightly uneven from tossing in her sleep, her teddy bear dangling from one hand, and she asked softly, "Uncle, David, are they going to come take me away?" The question struck him harder than fatigue, and he walked over, kneeling to meet her eyes, his voice steady but tender. "They will try, but I will not let them, and we will fight back the right way, with the truth and with the law." She swallowed, then whispered with more strength than he expected, "Then I want to help too. I'll tell the judge what they did, even if my voice shakes." David felt pride swell in his chest, because in that fragile voice he heard Richard's courage reborn, and he nodded. "When the time comes, you'll speak, and you won't be alone." Later that morning they returned to the library. Sarah Mitchell greeted them with a smile that carried both warmth and determination. She had spent the night compiling a comprehensive comparison chart of Richard's signatures, hospital admission logs, and the questionable stock contract. And she handed David the folder with precise notes. "The discrepancies are obvious. No jury could overlook this," she said, and then leaned closer, lowering her voice. "But I've also seen local blogs posting Margaret's version of events, claiming you're exploiting the child for her inheritance." David nodded grimly. "Let them speak. I will not fight this in tabloids, only in court." Amara stood close to Sarah, shyly holding out a drawing she had made of a librarian, a small thank you that made Sarah's eyes soften. "You're very brave, Amara, don't forget that," she whispered. In the afternoon, David escorted Dorothy and Franklin to Walker's office, a polished suite on the 14th floor with leather chairs and walls lined with law books. Paula Green, Walker's paralegal, offered them coffee and cocoa for Amara, creating an atmosphere more like a living room than a legal chamber. And when Walker entered, his gray hair neatly combed, his expression calm and authoritative, he greeted each of them with the dignity of equals, shaking hands with Dorothy and Franklin, before leaning down to Amara. "Hello, sweetheart. In here, grown-ups talk about complicated things, but I'll make sure you understand what matters." He plugged the USB into a secure laptop, playing the recording again, letting everyone hear Margaret's whisper instructing Richard to drink more until his death came faster. And the room fell silent except for the hiss of the audio. Franklin clenched his fists and muttered, "Evil, pure evil," while Dorothy dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, whispering, "I should have spoken sooner." Walker then slid the forged contract across the table, pointing out the forensic differences. And finally he placed Dorothy's handwritten statement beside Franklin's rough but heartfelt testimony, his voice steady as he said, "Together these build a case strong enough to request emergency guardianship and criminal investigation. But it won't be easy. They will attack your credibility, Dorothy, and they will exploit your poverty, Franklin. But I will request a protection order for both of you." Franklin leaned forward, his rough voice resolute. "Let them mock me. I have nothing left to lose. But I won't let them destroy that girl." Dorothy nodded beside him, her voice firmer than before. "I'm ready too. They can't silence me again." Amara sat quietly through it all, sipping her cocoa, but when she heard Franklin and Dorothy speak, she whispered, "I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me." And David immediately placed a hand on her shoulder. "Emma, this is not your fault. The guilty ones are them, not you. And the people here are helping because it is right, not because they have to." Walker leaned back, folding his hands. "The next step is court. But before then, we must expect intimidation. Margaret and Thomas will try to scare witnesses. They may even try to corner you in public. So from now on, every move must be cautious. No one walks alone. That night back at the penthouse, David checked every lock twice, installed a new security system, and informed building staff to monitor visitors closely, while Amara sat at the kitchen table coloring quietly, though the tension in her small shoulders betrayed the fear she tried to hide. And when she finally set down her crayon, she looked up and said, "Uncle David, if my dad was here, would he be proud of me?" David swallowed hard before answering. He would be more than proud. He would be grateful that you are brave enough to speak the truth. The child's eyes glistened, and she nodded as if sealing an unspoken promise to herself. Across the city, Margaret hurled a glass against the wall of her rented apartment, shards scattering across the floor as she hissed, "He's lining them up against us, he's using witnesses." And Thomas lit another cigarette, blowing smoke with a smirk. "Then we break the witnesses, scare them until they crawl back into silence." The morning of the hearing dawned with a sharp chill in the air, the city alive with horns and hurried footsteps. But inside the Lincoln that carried David Carter and little Amara Johnson to the courthouse, there was only silence broken by the hum of the engine. Amara clutched her teddy bear to her chest, her braids tied neatly, her small body stiff with nerves, and David glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his expression calm, but his heart thundering with the weight of responsibility. He had faced hostile boardrooms, cutthroat negotiations, and the eyes of investors who doubted him because of the color of his skin. But none of those battles carried the same gravity as the one he was about to fight today, because this time the cost was not measured in dollars, but in the fragile soul of a 6-year-old black girl who had already suffered more than most adults could endure. Outside, the courthouse cameras flashed as reporters gathered, headlines already swirling with accusations. Margaret Hayes had spent days painting herself in the press as a grieving widow unfairly robbed of her stepdaughter by a greedy black businessman, and Thomas Reed appeared by her side with carefully combed hair and a press suit, his smug smile fixed for the cameras, portraying himself as a dutiful uncle. But behind the polished facade, David saw only predators clinging to power, and he tightened his grip on Amara's hand as they walked through the entrance, their attorney, Professor Henry Walker, striding beside them, his thick case file under one arm, and Paula Green, the paralegal, carrying additional documents, all moving with the precision of a team prepared for war. Inside Courtroom 3, the walls paneled in dark wood and the judge's bench looming high, Judge Patricia Coleman presided with stern eyes, the bailiff calling the session to order, and the clerk reading the names of the parties. To the left sat Margaret with her attorney Avery Clark. To the right sat David with Walker, Amara beside him, Dorothy Clark and Franklin Moore waiting nervously in the gallery, and a cluster of reporters scribbling notes, the tension so thick that even the shuffle of papers seemed loud. Attorney Clark rose first, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Hayes, is a devoted mother who has cared for Amara since Richard Johnson's illness. She has been wrongly stripped of her guardianship by Mr. Carter, a powerful millionaire who seeks to exploit the child to seize control of the family assets. This case is nothing but abduction disguised as protection." Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her face contorted in the performance of grief, while Thomas folded his hands solemnly, both acting their parts as though the courtroom were a stage. But David remained unmoved, his dark eyes steady as he rose to speak, his deep voice resonant with controlled anger. "Your Honor, the child was subjected to psychological abuse, dragged outside, doused with water, treated as less than human by these very people who claim to love her. I have witnesses who saw it with their own eyes." Judge Coleman nodded. "Bring in the witness." Dorothy Clark rose, her hands trembling, but her voice surprisingly strong as she introduced herself. "I lived downstairs from the Johnsons. I saw Thomas Reed dragging Amara by the wrist, and Margaret Hayes carrying a bucket. They poured it straight over the little girl's head while she begged them to stop." Attorney Clark pounced quickly. "Do you hold any personal grudge against my client?" Dorothy shook her head, her voice cracking but firm. "No, I was afraid because they have money and influence. But the truth is I saw it happen, and I can't be silent anymore." Franklin Moore followed, his knit cap pulled low, his posture wary, but his voice rough with conviction. "I live in the alley out back. I heard her crying. I looked up and saw them dragging her like a sack. She stumbled, she begged, and I wanted to step in, but Thomas glared at me like he'd kill me. I'm saying this now because no child deserves that, not even a child with nothing, and I won't let her live like I've had to. The judge scribbled notes, her face unreadable, then turned to Walker, who stood and placed the USB on the table. Your Honor, this is a recording hidden inside the child's teddy bear by her late father. With the court's permission, I would like to play it. The judge gestured, and the room fell silent as Richard Johnson's weary voice filled the air. What is this bottle of medicine? I don't need this. When I take it, my heart races. Margaret, where did you get this? Followed by Thomas's flat reply. The doctor prescribed it, just take it. And then Margaret's whisper, chilling and undeniable. Let him drink more. Let him die already. A ripple of gasps swept the gallery. Dorothy covered her mouth. Franklin muttered, God help us. And even reporters lowered their pens, stunned. Attorney Clark sprang up, fabricated, spliced. Anyone could create such a file. But Walker was ready, producing a forensic verification report. The metadata confirms the file's origin. The timestamps align with Richard's final months. And digital experts confirm there are no signs of tampering. This is authentic. The judge examined the report carefully, her gaze shifting toward Margaret and Thomas, whose pale faces betrayed cracks in their performance. Walker pressed forward. Furthermore, regarding the death of Richard's wife, the vehicle's electronic control system shows deliberate tampering. The ECU and BCM were overridden. This was no accident, and only someone with direct access to the car could have done this. Records show Thomas Reed borrowed the vehicle during that period. Margaret fidgeted. Thomas's jaw clenched, but before they could speak, Amara suddenly stood, her small voice carrying across the courtroom, trembling but clear. If they loved me, they wouldn't have thrown water on me. They wouldn't have laughed when I cried. The entire room froze. The judge's gaze softened for the first time, and she instructed the clerk, record the child's words verbatim. Attorney Clark tried to recover, but Robert Thomas snapped, his composure shattering. The sound of the gavel still reverberated in David's chest as he carried Mara out of the courtroom, her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck, her tears soaking into his suit jacket. And though reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed like lightning storms, he kept his eyes forward, shielding her from the frenzy as they pushed through the courthouse doors into the cold air. The weight of the temporary guardianship order heavy in his pocket, not because of the paper itself, but because of the promise it symbolized, that Amara would never again be abandoned to cruelty. Paula Green hurried beside them, clutching the envelope of official papers, reminding David of upcoming welfare appointments. But her words blurred as his focus narrowed to the trembling child in his arms, whispering over and over, "Do I have anyone left?" And each time David answered with the same steady vow, "You have me, and you have yourself." The repetition not only for her, but for himself, reaffirming the bond that had already rooted deep between them. That afternoon, the Lincoln pulled up to the Johnson home, now empty. The front door, once slammed against Amara, now opening with the soft click of a new lock David had ordered, a locksmith changing the tumblers, while movers carried out the remnants of Margaret and Thomas's presence. And Amara froze on the threshold, her little shoes hesitating as she stared into the space that had been both a home and a prison, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm afraid to go in." David placed a reassuring hand on her back, his voice firm yet gentle. "From now on, this place holds no more shadows. Together we'll turn it into a beginning." And slowly she stepped inside, her teddy bear clutched tight, the scent of paint and emptiness filling the air, the walls bare, but waiting for new memories. The following day, people began to arrive one by one, not because they were asked, but because they chose to stand beside Amara, Emily Carter from the library, carrying boxes of children's books and small rugs, smiling as she set them down and said, "Every reading room needs a story. This one begins here." Dorothy Clark bringing fabric curtains she had sewn overnight, apologizing for crooked stitches, but determined to bring color to the windows. Franklin Moore arriving with a jacket draped over his shoulders and a small toolbox in hand, muttering with a faint smile, "Street skills still work, I'll build some shelves." And Linda Foster, the owner of the Corner Cafe, carrying trays of sandwiches and hot soup, her warm voice cutting through the chill. No one heals on an empty stomach. The house echoed with the sounds of hammering, laughter, and rustling fabric, David lifting paint cans, Franklin climbing ladders, Dorothy measuring curtains, Emily labeling books, Linda brewing cocoa, and Professor Walker moving room to room with lists of permits and documents. The transformation not just of a house, but of a vision. Until by evening a new sign was drafted on a whiteboard and circled in bold marker. Hope Bridge Center. Amara watched all of it with wide eyes, still uncertain if the joy around her could truly be hers, until David bent down beside her as she stood in the hallway and asked softly, "What would you like to see in your room?" She bit her lip, whispering, "A picture of my dad and maybe colors that feel like sunrise," and David nodded. "Then that's what we'll make." Days passed in a rhythm of renewal, Amara helping Emily organize books into neat rows, Dorothy teaching her how to measure fabric for the curtains, Franklin showing her how to hold a hammer without pinching her fingers, and Linda slipping extra cookies into her backpack with a wink. The house filling not only with furniture and supplies, but with a community bound by a child's courage. One evening as David folded blankets in the living room, Amara approached with hesitant eyes, twisting the hem of her shirt, and asked bluntly, "Do you really want to be my dad, or is it just because you miss my father?" The question caught him off guard, freezing him mid-motion, and he crouched to her level, meeting her gaze with steady sincerity. "At first it was because of your father. He once saved me when I was a child. I thought I was paying a debt. But now it's because of you, because my heart chooses you." Her lip quivered, her eyes filling. "If one day you don't remember him anymore, would you still choose me?" And he placed his hand gently on her cheek. "I might forget many things, but I will never forget the words I've spoken, and I will never stop choosing you." She threw her arms around him then, clinging tightly, and he held her close, feeling the shift from fragile hope to trust solidifying between them. Weeks later, with the help of Walker and community volunteers, the house officially opened as Hope Bridge Center, a sanctuary for children in need. Its rooms filled with books, warm meals, laughter, and the hum of belonging. And on the day of the opening, Amara stood proudly beside David, wearing a purple scarf Linda had knitted for her, her small hand gripping his as she whispered, "This is ours, isn't it?" And he nodded. Yes, ours. But justice had not finished its course. For even as the center flourished, the court case pressed forward. And one cold December morning, Professor Walker arrived carrying a thick envelope stamped with the seal of the court. Inside, the official ruling that Margaret Hayes and Thomas Reed had been sentenced for poisoning, fraud, and abuse. Their schemes shattered under the weight of testimony and evidence. Their names now etched not in triumph, but in shame. And David folded the papers carefully, exhaling with a deep relief he had carried for too long. That Christmas Eve, the center glowed with strings of lights and the sound of children singing uneven but heartfelt carols. Dorothy hanging peppermint candies in bowls, Franklin building a makeshift tree from recycled wood, Emily laying out new books wrapped in ribbon, Linda pouring cocoa and handing out cookies, and Amara running around the room, her scarf fluttering, her laughter bright. Until David called her over and placed a small wrapped box in her hands. "This is for you," he said, and she tore the paper to reveal a delicate wooden box with a lock and key. Snow fell lightly across the city on the first anniversary of Hope Bridge Center. Soft flakes drifting against the windows of the once broken Johnson home, now transformed into a sanctuary filled with children's laughter. Books stacked neatly on shelves Franklin had built, curtains Dorothy had sewn, the scent of cocoa from Linda's kitchen, and the quiet hum of belonging woven into every corner. Amara stood near the entrance wearing her purple scarf, her teddy bear tucked under one arm, greeting the other children as they arrived with smiles that carried none of the trembling fear that had once shadowed her face. Her voice steady as she told a new boy, "You don't have to ask to sit by the fire, it's for everyone." Inside the main room, a Christmas tree glittered with ornaments made by the children themselves, paper stars, wooden shapes carved by Franklin, drawings laminated by Emily, and at the top a small wooden angel with Richard Johnson's name etched carefully into the base. Amara had insisted it be there, a reminder of the father who once promised she was worthy, a promise now kept in full. David Carter stood near the back of the room, watching with quiet pride as Amara guided a group of younger children to the reading corner, showing them how to choose books and sit in a circle, his heart swelling not only because she had survived, but because she had learned to lead, her courage becoming a beacon for others. And when Emily approached with a stack of new donations and said softly, "She's different, David, stronger, freer," he nodded, answering, "Because she knows she is no longer alone." Across the room, Dorothy laughed with Linda as they hung another string of lights. Franklin hammered a loose nail on a shelf, and Professor Walker sat with a cup of tea, his presence a reminder that justice was not only won in courtrooms, but in the steady building of a life after verdicts had been handed down. And when he caught David's eye, he raised his cup slightly, a silent salute to the promise kept. As evening settled, David called the children together, his voice deep but gentle. Tonight is special not only because it is Christmas Eve, but because it marks 1 year since we opened these doors. 1 year since this house changed from a place of fear into a home of hope, and Amara stepped forward at his side, her small hand gripping his, her eyes shining as she spoke clearly. A year ago, I thought I had no one left, but now I have a family, and so does every child who comes here. The room erupted in applause, the children cheering, Dorothy wiping tears from her eyes, Franklin smiling wide despite his rough exterior, Linda clapping her hands with joy, and Walker bowing his head with quiet approval. After the celebration, when the children were reading by the fire and the adults shared cocoa in the kitchen, Amara pulled David aside, leading him to the photo of Richard that hung in the hallway, decorated with a wreath of evergreen and a ribbon, and she whispered, "Dad, I read your letter. I kept the truth safe, and now I'm not afraid anymore." Then turned to David and said in a voice full of conviction, "And you kept your promise too. You became my dad." David's throat tightened, his eyes wet as he knelt to her level, resting his forehead against hers, his voice steady though thick with emotion. "Yes, Amara, I became your father because my heart chose you, and I will never let you go." She wrapped her arms around him, holding tight, and in that embrace the weight of every cruel word Margaret had spoken, every scar Thomas had left, dissolved into nothing, replaced by the steady rhythm of love and protection. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in quiet peace, and inside the warmth of the center grew brighter, not from the lights strung across the walls, but from the spirit of community, resilience, and justice that had taken root, the children laughing, the adults sharing their gifts, and at the heart of it all a little girl, once cast aside, now standing tall. Her fear replaced by courage, her loneliness replaced by family. The story that had begun with cruelty and abandonment closed not with bitterness, but with renewal, a testament that evil may wound, but it cannot win when truth is carried forward with bravery. And as David whispered softly to himself while watching Amara lead the younger children in song, "Richard, she is safe, and she is free, and I kept my vow," he understood that the true measure of justice was not only in the punishment of the wicked, but in the healing of the innocent. And so the night ended not in silence, but in harmony, the children's voices uneven but strong as they sang together, their laughter spilling into the winter air, the lights of Hope Bridge Center glowing like a beacon, declaring to the world that when kindness stands firm against cruelty, the abandoned can find family, the broken can find healing, and every child can learn once again to hope. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Tell us what you thought of the plot. Did Amara's journey from abandonment to hope resonate with you? Share your perspective in the comments, and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Your thoughts and support keep these stories alive, reminding us all that justice, courage, and love can light the way even in the darkest times.